Paratopia, as promised last week, here is the interview with Rorke Rountree. They need no introduction. They're going to be staples around here, I'm sure. Riffing off of something I had asked on the message board, here is a very special parallel episode of their Devil's Advocate podcast. Dr. Stephen Rorke and David Rountree riffing on the possible physics of the paranormal, and so much more. Ready and go!
Devil's Advocate Podcast 3. David, you were saying the Paratopia follow-up.
Yeah, actually I went into the Paratopia message board, and I'd laid an egg in there earlier today about we were going to be recording the episode tonight, and did anybody have anything particular they'd like for us to dredge up? And Jeremy actually wrote, wormholes seem to come up a lot in paranormal discussions. I'd like to hear exactly what that means. How is it possible that wormholes can just open and close all over the planet, no problem, but there's the fear, even if unfounded, that the CERN collider might open a black hole that would suck up the planet? Well, that's pretty entertaining because, as we know, the collider only uses a small smidgen of the energy that bombards the Earth every day. Mm-hmm. So not a real good chance of us imploding ourselves into infinity with the collider. It's actually working on such a micro scale that the energy that it does release requires very special instrumentation to record. But the original pathway was the whole wormhole discussion.
Right.
And that tends to be discussed pretty much all of a sudden in all areas of paranormal research, from cryptozoology to UFOology to ghostology to what have you ologies. So that's probably a pretty cool thing to open up with, because we got lots of time to talk about things. So
absolutely,
let's explore the wormhole phenomena a little bit here. What say you?
Well, I guess if you look at all this as some sort of an interdimensional space-time slip thing, as an explanation for EVP, let's say, I mean, I can entertain the thought. It is a framework for understanding the paranormal, which is, I think, why, from a psychological standpoint, why it's attractive. So I would really say, in your case, it is a theory that fits the data. But in the case of some others, I think really they just find it attractive because it explains a whole lot. Kind of like, and this is not to be critical of Chris O'Brien, I think his work on the trickster phenomenon is really interesting. But the same way that this idea of a trickster explains everything, it becomes very attractive to say, the reason for all of these things is the trickster. Well, likewise, one could say, hey, the reason for all these strange events is stuff coming through wormholes. So that's a commentary on why folks find it attractive. And I'm sure you could speak better to how it fits the data and the theory and how they interlock well. Well,
I have been toying, of course, with the idea of this possibility for several years now, particularly the aspect of a special type of wormhole, because there are several different types of wormholes, actually. And the one that I'm actually interested in is a certain type of a Lorentzian wormhole. Mm-hmm. These hold the most promise to allow for travel, where actually a being, it would be possible, but in our case particularly, energy would be very possible to traverse these type of wormholes. And the reason why the wormholes can pop up all over the Earth is because, and not swallow the Earth, is because wormholes are getting confused with black holes, and they're really two different animals. A black hole is actually the result of a neutron star imploding, or a very large star going thermonuclear and collapsing in on itself and creating a huge gravity well that, opens up this huge black hole that, we don't know where it goes. And there's a whole event horizon where you can virtually rotate around it forever without getting sucked in. And then when you do get sucked in, you get stretched to this, like angel hair spaghetti. But a wormhole is something different. A wormhole is actually a conduit. And what can happen is it can be between two universes. It can be between dimensions. In fact, there's some theoretical thought that a wormhole actually is a dimension in itself, which makes a little bit of sense when you start getting into M theory. But for practical purposes, it's a big pipe between one reality and another. And these things are very unstable. In other words, they blink in and out in a quantum manner, whereas they will appear for brief periods of time and then they'll disappear. And then there are many, many wormholes associated with many, many areas around the world. And the fact that they don't stay open for very long probably lends to the fact that we haven't discovered them yet or have stumbled upon their effects and not clearly understood what we were dealing with. But looking at it from that aspect, wormholes are just doorways that open and close, and with their own rhyme or reason that we don't understand. And the data that we have collected seems to indicate that something of that nature is occurring based on the encounter we've had with high levels of gamma radiation, which would indicate matter colliding and being at least slightly out of phase so that it causes some minor annihilations, which in turn would give off the gamma radiation. Time slippage, where we have a time anomaly occurring, where the way time is measured is affected, which would indicate some type of bubble, space-time bubble is occurring. Then the reception of EMF, drops in atmospheric pressure, which would indicate a differential in the atmospheric pressure of the opening versus the actual environment. There's a lot of data that is indicating something is altering a very small section, a very localized area in a paranormal, I'll call it an event horizon. And what I really think is happening is as the throat or the funnel opens up, most of the things we're measuring is actually effects of the wormhole coming into being, blinking in, and only a very small percentage of what we're reading is actually the paranormal event itself.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this is based on two experiments in the same place, so, it's certainly far from being, a sure thing. But what we've encountered is pretty compelling evidence that this may be a possible explanation, and it's certainly something that we need to continue to concentrate on in our future investigations.
Now, speak specifically to some of the hardest data. I mean, it's tertiary, but it's some of the hardest data that supports your kind of working hypothesis of this, the gamma radiation that's been detected. Tie in
That's
quickly.
Huge.
It's huge, but tie in quickly how its meaning and the possibilities for this traversable wormhole issue.
Well, the whole thing is gamma radiation is the product of, generally speaking, either a thermonuclear explosion, some type of catastrophic event,
mm-hmm.
or contacting of antimatter and matter, which causes particle annihilation. Or in my theoretical aspect is I believe that there is matter that isn't antimatter, but it's matter that is slightly out of phase with our own matter, so that it doesn't cause a catastrophic annihilation as much as it causes like a micro-annihilation, where you've got subatomic particles annihilating and not atoms. And these subatomic particles, like, quarks, leptons, this sort of thing, when they annihilate, they give off a pretty high degree of gamma radiation. Now, unless your house is located on a uranium field, you're not going to encounter gamma radiation in your house unless you're in the middle of an X-ray storm, or you've got cosmic rays that are punching holes through the atmosphere and not being stopped, which is highly unlikely in a very localized area. So that was the huge clue that something entertaining was going on there. The second thing that's probably most entertaining was the actual appearance of EMF. I call it spontaneous EMF, where it just kind of comes out of nowhere and you're picking it up. And of course, much of this comes in the form of electronic voice phenomena. Some of it comes in the form of wave patterns that resemble brain waves, and these appear to be coming from nowhere. So by using a triangulation device to try to locate the point of entry of the EMF, we generally figured out that the location point was occurring a couple of feet off the floor near the center of the room. So that tells me that this spontaneous EMF is being generated in thin air, which was another clue that something has to be opening up and allowing this stuff to come through. And the idea is that while it may not be possible for a being to come through, although I'm not ruling that out because we have these things in cryptozoology that may be related, and UFOs and things like that, certainly pure energy can come through, and there's no argument about that. And that's what we're reading, these pure energy patterns that are coming through. And then there's other things involved, the time differentials, space-time anomaly, which would also indicate a potential dimensional rift or some type of trans-universal portal opening up. Excuse me. As well as the atmospheric pressure changes. And by the way, these atmospheric pressure drops are noted all over the world. People in England, investigators in England, first discovered that there was an associated barometric pressure drop just prior to a paranormal event, and they began using like wristwatches with barometers on them to help predict when an event was going to occur, with some degree of success. So, bearing that data into the mix, along with other things, elevated ion counts, increased level of atmospheric conductivity, and that sort of thing. I mean, we have a whole lot of things going on in a very localized area that have no rhyme or reason or explanation. So you have to start, when you can't find something in the normal to explain it, you have to start looking at the abnormal.
Yeah, in this case, the theoretical.
Yes, so you have to start looking in theory for what could possibly fit what was actually going on in the environment. And of course, also we would get temperature drops, and these drops were not areas, they were blobs of cold air, or blobs of cold that would, and they were kind of amorphous, they were very amoeba-shaped type things. And you could actually track them across the room with handheld ambient air temperature sensors and actually, figure out the size and shape and then track their movement. And there's all these things associated. Now, these cold spots tend to come out of this portal as well, or at least appear at the position where this other stuff is going on. So their entry point, whatever it is entering the same place everything else is. So it all kind of ties neatly into this package that says somebody just opened a door. And the only theoretical explanation for that type of doorway would be a theoretical wormhole.
Yep, and now we're switching roles a little bit, so I'm going to play the break it down role. So essentially, to answer that person questioning, a wormhole is, in theory, essentially much like a tunnel with two ends, each in separate points in space-time. And what you're discussing, in theory, would be an interdimensional transition. And you're not debating the fact that these could be transitory. You're not even making a statement about their relative size, because these could be microscopic wormholes. We've theorized about this, saying they don't have to be large like in sci-fi movies for information to travel through, and they could be rather instantaneous.
Absolutely. They could be a burst type thing where they just open, fire off a burst, and close.
Right, so we need to start thinking outside the box, like these are not stargates or something that open like in these shows.
And that's the thing. And also a wormhole is one way.
Well, yes, there's that too.
Energy or what have you, matter, can only travel one direction in a wormhole. Consequently, this brings up a very interesting dilemma. If something is coming and then it goes, how does it go?
What do you mean? Are you discussing directionality?
Yeah, say something comes into our universe. Something comes into our dimension, our reality. And it lingers enough to, say, move a salt shaker across the room or provide some interesting conversation or whatever, and then it goes. Now, how does it go if the wormhole is only one way? Well, I started doing a lot of digging, and this whole double helix thing, like in DNA, is turning up all through the universe in all sorts of places where you would never expect it to.
Mm-hmm.
So my hypothesis on this is that the wormhole that we're dealing with is a type of double helix, where you actually have a dual throat opens, and whatever you're receiving, whatever you measure, enters the environment for a period of time.
Oh, I see exactly where you're going. This is amazing. Yeah.
And then once it dissipates, it doesn't really dissipate. Instead of disappearing, it actually returns in a quantum fashion back through the attached throat.
Mm-hmm. So there is
no... We have a corkscrewing wormhole double helix that bores through, opens up, allows for phenomena to occur.
Or information to influence.
Or information to pass. And then the residual matter returns from whence it came.
No, that is incredible. Now we're in the truly theoretical now, but
we're way out in the theoretical.
But folks need to know that there are people much more brilliant than you or I who've worked a lot of this out, and this issue, or I should say, this possibility of exotic matter. Now we would have no way of measuring this, to be clear. Some of what you're measuring as tertiary effects may be evidence of this. But exotic, the issue of traversable wormholes, to be clear, this could only happen, this would only be possible if exotic matter with negative energy density could be used to stabilize them. And by that, we again don't mean any sort of like a Stargate. To stabilize could literally mean for a fraction of a second when you're speaking about things being active at the Planck scale, right? So.
Right.
So this exotic matter, it is theoretically possible that this could be going on. It's also, it's been in the literature. It seems to be the most mathematically exquisite way to explain this incredible thing called gravity, which is so spread out and yet so pervasive. This idea of many more dimensions, who knows how many, but all this coming together to say, hey, if they could be stabilized and there's every possibility of the dimensions, this would be a sensible way for someone to, if not intentionally communicate, maybe accidentally communicate, much in the way our television signals go out with no thought to their meaning or effect upon any other civilization. This may be the same effect we're seeing.
Yes, exactly. And the whole aspect of the gamma production may be a byproduct of that exotic matter meeting the matter of our reality, our universe, so to speak. And that's why we don't get a wormhole turning into a black hole or some other catastrophic explosive type of behavior. It's more of a cancellation is occurring between two radically different types of matter, and yet it's not antimatter. So the negative matter, exotic matter concept fits quite perfectly into the explanation for the data. So this, then, again, is another brick in the wall for building the case for the paranormal wormhole.
But it sure is. And it needs to be added again, because I like to pile on the, legitimate science. I like to pile that on our woodpile of discussion here. Many physicists believe that something called the Casimir effect is evidence that negative energy densities are possible in nature. And again, these negative energy densities would be a consequence of exotic matter existing here now with us. So
that's exactly right.
Yeah. So if there is, so again, the implications are incredible here. To go really nerdy, if somehow this were legitimized, that David were detecting the effects of exotic matter in the form of negative energy densities, thereby legitimizing this exotic matter Casimir effect connection, this could go a long way in validating a quantum foam hypothesis, which is sometimes used to suggest that tiny wormholes appear and disappear spontaneously at the Planck scale. And again, that's really tiny, but we don't need them to be large for information to come through. And it could also, in some ways, delegitimize the notion of the Schwarzschild wormhole, which would say a lot about all the metrics used to describe these things, and maybe forever ban the connection that people have in their minds, which you spoke about earlier. There's this connection in the mind of wormhole, black hole, and that's because of the math that underpins the Schwarzschild wormhole, which became popular as the what was that? The Schwarzschild predated the Einstein-Rosen. No, it didn't.
It actually was slightly after, but
slightly after, yeah.
It was a attempt to mathematically prove the whole concept of black holes.
You're right. And it became this eternal black hole was part of the problem, and the way the math worked out and the metrics, it became this eternal black hole problem.
Right.
And hence, the Disney movies and even these ridiculous drawings, which folks need to know. You see these drawings. This is an attempt to bring an approximation to the reader for understanding.
Exactly.
Because what all this math does, and what you're talking about, the possibility of a traversable wormhole, even if just for information, even if just a transient phenomenon, even at just at a very tiny scale. You essentially, to visualize, it's impossible for us to do it. Our brains almost don't work that way. You'd have to imagine a two-dimensional surface kind of folded along what mathematicians would ultimately describe as a non-existent third plane. You'd then have this bridge, which would be a consequence of all the exotic matter and all this we just discussed. So it's almost impossible to discuss this in pictures or any useful way beyond trying to explain that there's this possibility of, in theory, like a tunnel with two ends, each in separate points in space-time, to say nothing of what space and what time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the conundrum of the whole thing is that it could be from a completely different time, which would explain a lot of the anecdotal evidence surrounding a paranormal event. For example, you witness an apparition, let's say, that is dressed in Victorian garb.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this energy may have traveled from a different time and may be a projection or a holographic representation of the consciousness. And that transmission of the consciousness, let's say that consciousness becomes pure energy at some state, and that transmission becomes, to our perception, a three-dimensional holographic projection, which is what we see when people report seeing a ghost. But that energy, there's another part of the equation here that often gets overlooked, and that's the zero-point energy field, which the Casimir experiments that were done at Princeton, where they actually built a large air capacitor and measured energy between the two plates when no energy was applied, is significant because it not only proves the existence of zero-point energy, it in turn also proves the existence of exotic matter, which in turn links the existence of exotic matter with the zero-point energy field.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the zero-point energy field, I believe, is the Genesis energy. It was the energy that permeated through the uncreated universe prior to the Big Bang. And something occurred, the quantum singularity, which may have been an adjacent universe opening up a black hole and pouring into this one, where gobs of matter got sucked in and it literally exploded out from the entry point, which could have created the Big Bang. In turn, our black holes may be creating universes on the other side of them, just like ours was created. It may just be a whole series of bubbles in the quantum foam, and as those bubbles burst, a new existence is created or a new universe is born. Another Big Bang, for example. So I not only think our universe was created as a prospect of this system, but our universe as well is creating side universes splintering off of it from wormholes that we have observed in our own universe, which means that there is probably an infinite number of universes coming into being and disappearing every day, and we're just unaware of it because it's in such a macro scale, and we're so insignificant when compared to it in size. Mm-hmm. That we will never know for sure something like that's going on unless we happen to observe one actually, taking place.
It's the measurability problem all over, and
exactly.
Combined with the perspective problem.
And that's the conundrum.
Yep.
Not only can we not visualize it, we can't measure it, or can never hope to measure it with our current technology and knowledge as it is now.
Mm-hmm. I heard someone once speak about the possibility of frame dragging effects, and of course, everyone familiar with that would say, "Oh, well, this has got to be a localized thing," and that might explain some of the, the EVP voices detected. This electronic voice phenomenon. Perhaps this is to some degree a combination of, frame dragging and who knows, atmospheric anomalies. Or
Sure, and it's possible. And I'll be the first one to tell you that a lot of EVP has a natural explanation. A lot of it does.
Well, what I was about to do was attempt to kind of just, in its most gross features. I mean, we're not going to get into the the field equations from Einstein's notes, but
we would certainly put the audience to
yeah. But the point is, they butt up together nicely. That frame dragging taken to a grand enough scale would almost facilitate what you were discussing earlier about what you'd need at one end for traversable wormholes.
Right. Why don't you take a second and explain frame dragging? Because I'm sure there are people out there going, "Huh? What? What?"
Oh, right. Well, I
know
folks familiar with the general principle of relativity, right?
Correct.
It deals with effects in the vicinity of rotating massive objects. So the easiest way to do this would be to think of space as molasses and think of the heavy object as a bowling ball. And as this heavy object spins at whatever rate, it has an effect upon this molasses. And you could almost see that at some points, the effect of the molasses, the way it interacts with that heavy object in its rotation, is such that you'll have a fairly uniform activity. I know we're discussing fluid dynamics. It's a completely wrong comparison, but for the purposes of picturing it in your mind.
But for visualization.
Yeah.
Think vortex.
Yes, so right, so you're thinking vortex. Now, you've got this
vortex around the ball.
You've got this pretty uniform effect happening, right? But occasionally, a drop or two of the molasses will spin back in on the ball and touch it a second time. That would be an idea of like rotational frame dragging. It's called the lens Thirring effect. Anyway, it's like a frame of reference thing.
What it actually is it is turbulence. And what happens is it creates a ripple within the vortex. And this is purely visualization now. And what that does is it creates a turbulent effect which affects the uniformity of the vortex.
Like a perturbation.
Yes. And so in that area where that disturbance occurs, you have weird things occur. You have probabilities alter in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the area where the fun stuff occurs. And that's really, probably that was a really good way to have a visualization of it.
Well, we tried, but if folks want to read more about that, there was this really cool gravity probe B experiment that verified all this lens Thirring effect stuff. That's basically rotational frame dragging. There's other kinds of frame dragging which may apply, but like you said, we don't want to put people to sleep. There's a linear one, and if dimensions move like sheets on top of each other, that may apply in the macro. And then there's another kind of sort of frame dragging effect called static mass increase, which I could see how in a real tertiary way um, it may relate to what we were talking about earlier with this issue of these special regions where we might see the effects of exotic matter. All right, so all that being as it may, why don't you tell folks, we mentioned Planck scale a few times, and then I'd recapitulate and say, well, that means, teeny tiny. Just how tiny is the Planck scale, and why would that still be okay for to facilitate the effects we see, because it would allow information to pass?
Yes, and that's it. The key here isn't so much size, it's ability for energy to pass. And like we say, that could be 8 foot across, it could be 2 micrometers across.
That's right.
I mean, literally, it could be the size of a micron. So I think it's slightly larger than that because of the effects and the area of effect. But again, this is speculation at this point. But the whole concept of the wormhole is our best attempt to offer a scientific explanation for the source point of paranormal-like phenomena. And that's why we're beating it like a dead horse right now.
No, absolutely. And the reason I think it's important is because if we don't if we don't qualify how small the Planck scale is, someone may go with your theory and then say, now wait a second, it seems that the most well-established, theoretically possible traversable wormholes are these ones that exist at the Planck scale, right? And then they'd see how small the Planck scale is, they'd say, it's smaller than a proton? So now wait a second, but smaller than a proton doesn't mean it will not allow the wavelength of a photon, for example, to pass through, which it would, and that's exactly right. That's information. So
it sure is. Yeah, a lot of information can be put on a photon.
Yes, you're not kidding.
So, I mean, and here's the thing. This is what makes it so vital for mainstream science to actually be interested in what we're doing, because we may be on the verge of proving that certain quantum effects exist on a macro level.
Oh, yes. This is the scalability issue, and we can't beat this dead horse enough either.
No, and that's huge. I mean, because we may be on the verge of actually proving a theory to be fact. And in quantum mechanics, that's a big rarity, because most of it is pure theory anyway. I mean, it's like totally theoretical physics. So, I mean, the whole concept, I mean, the only thing that would be just as big as this would be if they find Higgs boson. Higgs boson. That would be huge as well.
That sure would. Change
that
everything.
Would totally change the playing field. But yeah. It's interesting that CERN is actually in the race with Fermilab. They're in a race with each other to find Higgs boson.
Yeah, that's a very good competition.
And it's a great race to watch, to be a spectator of. But we're looking at it from a different aspect, and the aspect that we're looking at has huge implications as well. The only problem is some of the greatest minds in the world are working on the search for Higgs boson, and a couple of people like me are looking for the wormhole.
But now, it needs to be said that some folks, anonymous and spoken for, they've been in communication with you, and some serious minds, some folks that you've been incredibly impressed with.
Yes, that actually is true, and I think I have actually pontificated with them in such a manner that they were actually interested to the degree of offering up potential courses of action to follow up on some of these things, which to me is just breathtaking in many ways, because for so many years in this field I felt like I was the Lone Ranger out here.
You were.
Doing things that people thought I was crazy to start with for even doing, why bother?
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't have the vision I had when I saw these things and said, there's something that's very unusual here that needs further explanation, And most of the time, these things are dismissed out of hand as being a product of the witness's psyche. But I can tell you that
guilty.
Having witnessed some very peculiar things over the last 30-some-odd years myself, I can't say that. and having several people who have different psyches witness the same things and actually reaffirm what each of us witnessed kind of takes it out of the realm of the psyche and more into the realm of the physical. And that's, I think, what got me so into this was, a paranormal experience that I had when I was young, and then several other isolated paranormal incidences as I grew up. And then finally, when I was in the military, a paranormal incident occurred that probably saved my life. Mm. And then a series of paranormal events that occurred. When I say they were things that I couldn't explain. Mm. That occurred that actually made me say, I want to know what's going on.
Yeah.
This is getting kind of weird,
Yeah.
And that's really what got me started into this whole thing. I mean, when I was young, I started reading a lot of books about this stuff because I'd had something happen, and I was curious, and I was young, very impressionable. And I had the blessedness to live next door to a fellow who was a retired professor. He was an engineer. He helped design the Liberty aircraft engine during World War II. And in his retirement, he was a pattern maker. And he had literally made patterns for the Apollo space capsule, different fittings and stuff like that. In fact, after the fire of Apollo 1, he redesigned the oxygen fitting that was the primary cause for the malfunction that caused the fire. Mm-hmm. So this man had a bookshelf full of weird books. I mean, he taught me trigonometry when I was 12 years old, and stuff like that, and he taught me how to woodwork and things like that. But he had all these books, like by Frank Edwards and all these different paranormal writers, Ignatius Donnelly. I read about Atlantis. I read about ESP. I read about the Rhine Center and all this research that was done as a kid. So it's kind of ironic that today I'm a professional member at the Rhine Center when reading about J.B. Rhine and his early research with, he's actually the father of parapsychology. He coined the term parapsychology in his book. But to actually be a part of that now, it's kind of like a dream come true in a very abstract way. But reading all this junk, which people thought was just, dime store novel trash that was out there, got my juices flowing, and I started wanting to find Bigfoot, and I started wanting to see a UFO. And while I never saw a strange creature, I have seen a UFO. So, and then the paranormal, ghosty part of it, of course, is another legend all of its own. But that's what started me down the path, and I was just an average, kid reading stuff that was just weird and fascinating, and it made its mark. So. And now here we're standing on the precipice of what may be a huge, huge discovery, not only in the realm of paranormal, but in the realm of quantum mechanics.
Oh, yeah.
And I look back upon the journey, and just like the Grateful Dead says, what a strange trip it's been,
Well, and at the same time, couldn't have gone any other way.
Yeah, exactly. The probability is this is where I would be. And it's kind of like Douglas Adams. He said something I'll never forget. He says, I'm not where I set out to be, but I'm where I ought to be.
See?
So, it's like you start out on a path, and you never end up really where you start out. You really end up someplace else, and if you're lucky, you end up where you're supposed to be. And I kind of think that's where I'm at right now. But
yeah, well, I think it is, too.
It's a very exciting time for me right now because I'm on the brink of a lot of things, and every day is a discovery. So it's and it feeds, the juices. So when one thing is discovered, you build upon it until it collapses, if it does. And if it doesn't collapse, then you build upon it more. And that's basically the step-by-step pathway to knowledge. So, but that's the whole wormhole shtick.
No, it sure is. And to further kind of bolster and support this notion, we have referred to the literature and this and that being founded or foundational theory. Well, we can bring it to the everyman level with National Geographic News, and I know that this is going back to 2008, but there's an article called "Unknown Structures Tugging at Universe," study says. And there's actually, I'm surprised a bad sci-fi movie hasn't been named after this yet, but
give it time.
Dark Flow was named in a nod to dark energy and dark matter, which are obviously two other unexplained astrophysical phenomenon. Although legitimate as they may be, dark flow is highly theoretical at this point. But the point is, this notion of what underpins the theory of dark flow could rewrite the laws of physics is the point of this article. Absolutely. And these are NASA Goddard space scientist guys talking and astrophysicists talking, and essentially they're
super nerds.
Yes, the super nerds are claiming that on the outskirts of creation, that there are these unseen, and they call them structures for lack of a better term, tugging on our universe, almost like cosmic magnets. And they say that everything in this known universe, that's why I brought up the directionality question much, much earlier, because I thought immediately this article, because everything in this known universe is said to be racing toward what they call, quote, the massive clumps of matter at more than 2 million miles an hour.
Yes.
And and
we are continually accelerating. I mean, we are going faster and faster.
But now they have decided that this has become such a uniformly accepted notion, empirically resultant to some of the probes we've sent out and the math that has then been done, that they're calling this movement, the researchers have dubbed it dark flow. Okay, so the point is that, and I'm thinking implications here, this would have to be extra universal matter.
Yes.
Right, and it suggests then that our universe is part of something bigger, like a multiverse.
Yes.
Right, and that whatever is out there would have to be very different from the universe we know.
Yes.
Otherwise, it wouldn't have this magnetic and clashing effect.
One of the things that I use when I speak publicly is for this concept of multiverse is the old clothesline and the sheets hanging on it routine.
Oh, and yes, the way they touch.
How they don't move normally, and they don't interact normally. But when a wind blows, a gentle breeze will blow, they'll start to sway, and eventually in places they'll touch and matter transfers.
That's right.
Well, that wind is the dark flow. The dark flow is pulling multiple universes, and that is like a big wind that flaps these brains or flaps these realities or flaps these universes to the point of where they touch and fold and interact and create interference between them, where laws of physics are twisted in a very hideous manner. And I believe that they're on the right track. I believe that this dark flow is the inter-universal energy that creates the interactions between these multiple universes. Because it has to be something independent of the universes themselves, because it affects all of them.
That's right.
And these structures are outside the realm of the multiverse, but affecting every aspect of the multiverse.
Yeah, and if this were kind of quantum stuff taken to a much larger scale, I'm betting by structures, they're referring to some mathematical template they've kind of, some new calculus they've laid out to describe these clouds of probabilities when the rules bend. It's my guess.
I'm wagering, this is the way I look at it. From the smallest microscopic particle to the universe and orbits of planet, everything is orbiting a central body. From all the way up to the atom, all the way out to planets, stars, the galaxies, everything rotates. Everything has an orbital schism attached to it. So I'm anticipating that multiverses are also orbiting.
Yeah, that's sensible.
And then they're spinning and orbiting. There are times when there are multiverses we will never interact with. but there are those that we will continue to interact with
Mm-hmm.
because of their localization to our own universe.
Now, the one thing we can assume they share with us, and I know we are a slave to the arrow of time, but I think we've got to assume that they would also be a slave to the arrow of time if there were these, post or supra fourth dimensional beings.
Well, you'd have to look at it kind of abstractly because a lot of people conceive time as being something that moves or that flows, and that's simply not the case. Time is just an interval. It's a gap between events.
That's right.
And to me, time is a landscape. It's like we're standing on a flat plane, and that plane is time. So to move to a new position or to move to a new time, we shift our location on that landscape. Now, in the course of our day-to-day living and everyday lives, as the minutes tick away, which is a very human and notion that was created for us to keep our sanity and schedule our meetings and things like that.
Yeah, it's our
we are slowly blowing across this landscape for the length of our lives. And history is laid out across this landscape. So it's theoretically possible, by using a wormhole, to move from one position on that landscape to another. Now, it's hard to visualize this because we're looking at time like a dimension, like it's a dimensional existence, and I think it is. I think it is a dimension. It would make it a lot easier if it was. So I'm running with it.
Yeah, it's temporal, for real.
But this is a dimension that's interacting within our own perceived three-dimensional world. So in other words, we're perceiving in three dimensions. Well, there's no law in physics that prevents. We know now with M theory that there's at least 11 dimensions, possibly more. I would wager there's probably an infinite number of dimensions. But there's no law in physics that prohibits any of those dimensions from combining in three or more gatherings to create another reality that would occupy the same spatial existence we do, but would be oblivious to us and us to them. So there are layers of probabilities and possibilities involved in this whole study that we're in.
No, it's true. The rules could change so drastically that this business of the arrow of time. But now I'm thinking, though, kind of going from your notion that these larger patterns apply. That things are circular, orbital. That there are perturbations in these orbits, and this leads to novelty, and this kind of thing. If we look at how ingrained, now I know when we say time, we're talking about a metric and a unit of measurement, and it's the clock is circular because the Earth is spherical, and I get that, but there's every reason to believe that pattern of enslaved to the arrow of time would hold as well. Now, I know what you're saying is that we could also expect to completely not be able to understand what it's like in this theoretical other place of possibilities, because there could be
our perception
could be a confluence of physical realities that are completely we can't conceive of them.
We can't arrange them with our thought process or our logic process. And here's something else that even further complicates it, is we may see something foreign in our reality that we see something that is not what we're seeing. But because what we're seeing, our brain cannot define, it attaches a definition to it so it can understand it.
Oh, like it makes a cultural construct out of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because we may witness something so totally foreign to us that we can't assemble it.
Yeah.
And therefore, to maintain our sanity, our brain assembles it in something we can recognize. So,
which is really, in the end, a completely rational thing.
Yes, and my whole notion is that we have to check and recheck everything we do, because this may be a product of what we're dealing with as well. So, real research in this, and I hate to use the word field, but for a better word, to me it is a field. To other people, it's, a flower bed. But to me, I have to look at all of these aspects. I have to look at the whole, the sum total of everything conceivable that could be affecting the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And
Sure.
I have to have a lot of help in that because I do not have a real, I took deviant behavior, in college and things like that. But, I'm really not a psych major at all. So I often have to talk to people with that kind of background to understand perception in the purely psychosis of the event. In other words, when something occurs, there's the reality of the event, and then there's the psychosis of the event that occurs with it. Now, the weight of the anecdotal evidence of the eyewitness account hinges upon the psychosis of the event. And I know that's a heavy thing to say, but how that person's perceived what they perceived is tantamount to what they perceived. And that's the part that's very difficult to analyze.
Now, you do mean the perception of the event.
Yes. I mean, when that person sees something happen, their eyewitness testimony is relying upon their perception, what they perceive the event to be. Now, if it's an isolated witness who was by themselves when something happened, it's very difficult to analyze that event because you're dealing with a single point of view and a single perception, and you have no idea how much of it is colored or how much of it is a product of the psychosis of the event. This is why multiple witness of the same event is so valuable, because if you have multiple psyches, multiple individuals who perceive the same thing, that takes it out of the realm of a manufactured reality from the brain, because people are not alike. They're each going to manufacture, if it's a manufactured aspect, they're each going to assemble a different reality that they perceived.
Okay, so just to be clear, because psychosis of an event, like when you say that, I think most folks are going to jump to, the idea that you're referring to a severe mental disorder.
Right. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying a thought disorder, a perception disorder.
Ah, yeah. So, this is what so maybe we could just, if you agree with my understanding of the term, we might get on board with this term. I just would rather refer to that as anomalous perception, because this way we don't tamper with what is a pretty good definition for psychosis. That means it's a severe mental disorder in which contact with reality is lost or highly distorted. Now you're talking about less severe and rather temporary.
Stephen, we have to establish that, though, too, because there is a psychosis involved with many people that experience these events.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, that's true.
And you know that better than anybody, so it's very important that we segregate this abnormal perception from the psychosis that can occur.
And this gets to the real pith of a question.
Yes, it does.
And I'm going to ask the essential question, which is really a signal to noise question and beyond. How much is so in all of these events we've discussed scientific underpinnings. Now we're a little under an hour, and we're about to transition from the theoretical underpinnings, the possibilities of a new math and science that might somehow allow the paranormal to be the bridge between our understanding of the standard model and what is the model of everything beyond. And now we're moving into really the observer and the role the observer plays in this, and how
is huge.
You can't extricate the observer from the process.
Absolutely
right.
Not.
So we need to discuss, which is precisely why we're about to ask the question: how much is anomaly, and how much is anomalous perception?
That's exactly right.
And that is
huge.
Yeah, it's the essential guiding question when you're going to get into this notion of, hey, to what extent do subjects protect against disconfirmation? To what extent do subjects, like you said, confabulate or even enter a state of psychoses to somehow cope with what they may have experienced or seen?
Exactly.
Yeah, and those are legitimate questions.
Exactly. And I feel very strongly that this is an area that parapsychology should be concentrating on, because I think it's a legitimate experimental path to follow. And there's not a lot of work being done. There's a little more being done with perception now, and there's a lot of work being done on intent.
Oh, yeah.
Power of intent. There's a lot of stuff like that. But the actual perception, the problem is that the previous research that's been done on the human perception relating to these type of events has always been of a negative nature. It's always been as trying to classify the person into a mental status, trying to catalog them into a notion that they're, this or they're that, or they have some mental malady involved in what they're experiencing. And while that may be the case in some of these cases, it's certainly not universal. There are instances that stand out like a sore thumb that defy these explanations, because these are rational people like airline pilots, chief of police that have experiences that you cannot discount as being, someone that didn't have their Thorazine this morning. So, I mean, these are things that have to be looked at seriously, and they are not by the majority of the psychological field, although we're starting to see a little more of it now, but that's because of, like, the effects of quantum neurology, all these quantum mechanics seeping into other areas of science, and that sort of thing. And
well, we might want to walk the eavesdroppers to our conversation, maybe from some of the more basic stuff that surrounds perception, and then end up with the Stuart Hameroff stuff, which is really kind of higher order thinking. And if I would fear if folks don't kind of have a primer on it. You had read my Inference of the Best Explanation paper, right? Where essentially I get into, that's a short title for it, but essentially it was my decision-making model for continuance of the investigation of Spiricom, which was brought up on the last Paratopia show. And I had a discussion of logical fidelity and irrational mimetics. And I got in pretty deep into like a psychobiological explanation for the paranormal ethos in the human, and perhaps...
I mean, you of all people are good to talk about it, because you have explored this in that particular case pretty dramatically, and so I'm kind of sitting back and enjoying this now, because you're getting ready to lay the egg.
Well, let's hope it's the golden egg. But we ought to give a quick primer in case, because we can't assume folks listen to Paratopia or the Devil's Advocate.
I'm sure there's a lot of people that have no idea exactly the mechanics of what we're talking about.
So just real quick, I'll lay out what the Spiricom story is. From the mid-1960s to the early 1980s, research on the development of a technological means of communication with the dead was conducted by this Meta-Science Foundation. And there was a president who was George W. Meek. He was the benefactor to William J. O'Neill, a self-described psychic electronics engineer who supposedly developed a device that would facilitate two-way conversations with the dead, and they called it Spiricom for spirit communications. Okay, that's the short and long of it. In 1980, this William O'Neill figure, who I explore in depth in that paper we just referred to, again, a fellow who kind of fits the schizotypy being this psychological concept which describes a spectrum or continuum of personality characteristics and experiences related to psychosis, to tie in David's term earlier. And I think in O'Neill's case it was schizophrenia, but we're not saying that this is all schizophrenia. We're just being real clear about the terms. And that idea of latent schizotypy is an interesting one, because it's the psychological field's way of saying, well, latent schizotypy, does that mean that someone could be made crazy by certain...
that could trigger a reaction.
Yeah, see?
That's the whole concept. Something can happen to bring the latency out.
That's right. And so it kind of begs us to to look at this stuff through the lens of William J. O'Neill supposedly making contact with a discarnate, a dead NASA scientist named George J. Mueller through this device called Spiricom. And it's an excellent starting point and an excellent, it's nothing more than a case study, which I will admit at the outset it's the weakest form of research. It is not an experimental design of any sort. There's no measurement, then treatment, then post-measurement. There's none of these, good things. But it is a great opportunity, a case study, to try to bring all of the theoretical understandings to bear upon the problem. And I know we throw around these words a lot, and I think I might have even used theory wrong a couple times tonight. But, when we say theory, a lot of listeners might think, oh, it's just a theory. Well, when we say theory, and I know we make every effort to use it in its proper term, a theory is a well-established principle that has been developed to explain some aspect of the natural world or an observed phenomenon. So it's not weak at all. The theory arises from repeated observation and testing.
And much of what we have discussed tonight had fallen into the realm of hypothesis.
Yes, yes. Now, hypothesis plays into theory. Yeah. Yeah.
And the hypothesis is actually the route for the path that you'll travel to make the theory.
That's right.
Or to modify the theory.
When the tested hypotheses are widely accepted, this becomes a theory if you incorporate facts, laws, and other predictions, right? So the theory predicts events in general terms, while the hypothesis kind of makes a specific prediction about a specified set of circumstances.
It's the seed you plant.
That's right. Okay. Right. So to be clear, what I'm about to discuss are in fact psychological theories that they've been extensively tested and generally accepted, and a hypothesis, while that is a speculative guess that has, for the most part, yet to be tested fully. Okay. Right. So a lot about I want to say. I don't want to have to keep repeating. This is in the literature. That's in the literature. Because all this stuff I'm about to say is in the literature.
And that thing that's important to remember too is the hypothesis that you come up with. You are led to that hypothesis by a series of events.
Oh, sure.
That may seem unconnected at first, but a connection appears, and your hypothesis forms based on the appearance of the connections of these events. And that holds true for any discipline that you're in, whether it's psychology or physics or mathematics or what have you. The foundation for the path that you create is the same through all of them, and the methodology is the same through all of them. So in that aspect, yes, we have been talking a lot about hypotheses in my conversation when we were discussing my aspect of it, but I'm working towards the theory.
That's right, yeah.
The theory is forming as we're going. In your case, you are actually relying upon established theories in the psychological community to provide a framework for the categorization of what you encountered in the case study, and that needs to be clear too.
Yeah, but the way it's grafted onto the Spiricom story, I think it develops like an explanatory schema for so much that goes on in the paranormal, and it may help to some extent complement the work you're doing, which I admit to only understanding in a limited way. So using this Spiricom as the case study, the jumping point, why do that? Well, just to give a rationale at the outset, that even if the listener had never heard of it, Spiricom was touted for the greater part of the last 2 decades to be like the best case in point, the best evidence, the most amazing data set, the tape recordings of these two-way communications with the dead. It was considered to be like, electronic voice phenomenon in real time. So it was touted as this amazing data set. So I figuring the data set's like imminently testable. It's a really well documented case, so it made for a good case study. So that's why I was using it. Plus, there's this incredibly interesting figure, Bill O'Neill. So we're going to get into things like a discussion of selective analysis, which I can honestly say I've seen you avoid at every possible turn, but this is something that people do by accident all the time if they don't have a scientific habit of mind. We're going to discuss over the next few minutes adopting extra-cognitive conclusions as beliefs, and then maybe we can make a transition tonight, David, if you're on board with this, where we almost set a new way of doing things on the Devil's Advocate, where we might almost establish links in chains of evidence, and then almost take like a prosecutorial bent, and almost play the Devil's Advocate and say if something is considered a pile of BS or not.
Yeah, exactly.
That could be interesting to stick with the whole Devil's Advocate
Oh,
motion.
oh yeah, I'm saddled up. I'm ready to roll.
Sweet. Well, all right. All that being said, I think it was touched upon briefly, but it needs to be said why Spiricom, this case in point could hold some interesting implications. So, like, why continue to study something if my conclusions about it are that the operator of the device was sketchy, a schizophrenic, and all this? Well, because if these explanations for Spiricom, we're only going to look at 3 of them for the moment. One, let's say it was really actually evidence of instrumental transcommunication with the dead. EVP, real-time EVP sessions. That's one explanation and one possibility. A second one, let's say it was a hoax perpetrated upon or by William O'Neill and George Meek. Or maybe 3, what if it was one of these, like a self-deceptive expression of William O'Neill's delusions, or what's called in the literature pathologies of belief. Whether they were consequent to his schizophrenia or not is almost secondary, except that all this could have been made possible by his skills as a ventriloquist, and really responsive to the fringe idea of after-death communications by technological means. And I call it that, but it really should be called the ever-developing cult of techno-mediumship. So that in itself is a meme, isn't it? I mean, this cult of techno-mediumship.
Yes.
It grabs hold of people. There are people who maybe go about this in a way where it becomes obsessive, and they are listening to cricks and cracks and static, and they're up at 3 in the morning and believe they're talking to invisible friends from a dimension called time stream, and all of this, and that can become problematic, and that has to be taken out of the data set. This is why David and I speak at this level from the human condition of the situation to the theoretical implications of it all, because unless you excise from the data set these potential problems, you are leaving in the data set really what amounts to invisible tripwires of grief that you're just stringing for yourself later to say, well, why didn't I take this out? So we have to have a means of doing this. And so one way of doing that is to look at the perception of the individuals involved. And that's not just to say credibility. We all know about credibility. And it is important from one standpoint. But to continue then. So if the first explanation were true, factually true, that interactive instrumental transcommunications with a dead scientist occurred in 1980, just look at what that would do for world religions. Just leave science aside for a moment, right? It would validate religion as a framework for understanding the anomalous and the ineffable to some degree. It would validate what I think is it's a Christian for sure, but I think it's a Catholic notion, this Aquinian principle of plenitude. And of course, for science, it could provide science with evidence for the existence of extra dimensions. And if what David is sensing is in fact communications, it would then be logical to assume that these are communications from post fourth dimensional beings. So evidence for the existence of parallel universes or a many worlds model in a universe are kind of what's at stake here for scientific implications, right? Okay, so not to mention this too. This is pretty cool. That there is the possibility for science. Science would find this very interesting. What if the observer in this equation has got more to do with this than we think, and what if it's all comes down to an understanding of what thought is and how it affects the physical. So if it's that too, we might end up understanding that the ITC phenomenon or EVP dataset might support some expression of human potential, like psychic abilities. And I'm not saying that's my particular view. I'm just saying, while not in the purview of this conversation, perhaps that's one possibility that EVP, just like reverse speech, is not seen as something, or reverse psycholinguistics, or whatever the literature might call it. This idea that there are messages and speech spoken backwards as well as forwards and interpreted by the subconscious mind and all this. So I know that's just a theory, but it's just an example. It's a tie-in how EVP doesn't necessarily have to be seen as something relegated to the spiritual domain. It could be an expression of human potential.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, so we have to leave those
and we
possibilities.
Can't neglect any of this. I mean, this is always has to be kept in mind.
Yeah, no, exactly. And now let's look at something that's probably more mundane, and it is, because it's a lot of fun to talk about the implications related to physics, and that might include advancements in the we discussed scalability of quantum events. That is way cool to talk about, but if we bring it down to what we discussed as the second explanation for something like Spiricom or full-fledged two-way interactive ITC or EVP conversations, what if the second explanation that there was a hoax perpetrated by O'Neill and then by himself or on O'Neill? Then there are also many implications for study of what we spoke about last week. I called them pathological group dynamics. There's also implications for study of persuasion theory and the spread of fringe ideas as reality. And this is important because you don't really want the spread of fringe ideas as reality. You want actual reality, if I'm correct.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So further implications of study really would include how subjective notions that motivate, amateurs experimenting with unknown phenomenon are amplified by a lack of critical judgment. This is a type of, it's called in the literature, it sounds harsh, but it's a kind of intellectual pathology. Folks would know it as magical thinking.
Yeah.
And if there's just a little too much magical thinking sprinkled on just about any natural phenomenon, you can turn it into something where, you just have to tell everyone what you had seen. And, yeah.
Exactly right.
Yeah, and this notion, and I know we're throwing a lot of verbiage out there, so I guess folks can pause or jot it down, or maybe I'll send you like a tag cloud with all these cool phrases to look up. But another cool one is pre-decisional distortion. And I think O'Neill was subject to this. I think a lot of folks who study this might be subject to this. And if everyone who wanted to contribute to the data set were to consider pre-decisional distortion, which is the tendency to evaluate incoming evidence in support of current beliefs, that would be an area for further research, because that might kind of screen out those folks who, I guess, what's it called, David? Cherry picking?
Yeah.
Cherry picking evidence?
Yes.
Yeah, so these seem like all real basics, but you can see that I'm building a case here that someone like William O'Neill, this operator of the Spiricom device, who of course is the perfect storm of a schizophrenic with ventriloquist skills, with pre-decisional distortion, amplified by a lack of critical judgment, so remarkable as to be really nearly unique, except for some of the folks on the scene nowadays. So, we could have a discussion of fantasy proneness and and what's called subculturally available scripts. This makes sense, right? When someone experiences something like you said, now it's time to fit it. It's time to fit it into something we know. And we do that. Everyone does that with available scripts. And these are memes that are strung together, like these infectious ideas strung together. People may adapt these to movie plots. We've seen this, where someone will say, "Hey, this is just like, The Entity," or something, right? And the next thing you know, confabulation occurs, because your mind, as far as disaggregating the data and recombining it into some whole new thought, your mind isn't really distinguishing between the movie plot and the details of the film, The Entity, and what you experience. And now you get confabulation.
Yep.
Where you're now adding details to fill in blanks, and sometimes you even fill in blanks that conform with culturally available scripts. And now,
right,
to make matters even more dangerous, David, and you probably have more experience seeing this than I do, to make all this fantasy proneness, and the issue of subculturally available scripts, even more dangerous, they can be reinforced by the rewarding, focused attention of members in the subculture. So these little groups get together, and now what would ordinarily be a story that would have them mocked and laughed at in public, the general public at large, right? Like the old line, "Hey, they have nothing to gain by sharing their paranormal experiences with the general public."
Right.
Well, that's true, but the opposite is true regarding the sharing of paranormal experiences with a population of paranormal enthusiasts.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, the notion that people have nothing to gain is belied by two empirical observations. One, the compulsion to tell the story over and over again, and what we see is a pretty consistent pattern of confabulation, which has already been described. And there's almost like a one-upsmanship, like, well, you saw this, and I saw this plus that. And we see this because, this is how compulsion to tell the story and confabulation works. And we see this is a nice overlap with alien abductions.
Yeah.
Besides the self-aggrandizement that we see when people say, like, well, the ghost had a message for me, and I have this special. Well, likewise, the alien abductee or /contactee, they had a message for me. They showed me things. I'm so important. I'm to be picked up and tested. Or likewise, the folks around shortwave radios listening to static pops and invisible voices, and they might say, well, they're communicating with me. Time Stream has a message of some impending doom, or some great importance. So anyway, these are commonalities that pop up so often. It's kind of like saying, it's kicking you in the teeth, saying, "Hey, there's a pattern here. You might want to look at it." Right. So that's what I've done, as I've looked at these patterns, and it led me to a discussion if the second explanation of a hoax perpetrated by O'Neill were true. Or really, even if the second explanation were factually true, when interpreted as a hoax perpetrated upon O'Neill and Meek, that's pretty interesting too. Now, I would suggest in a future show, if you wanted to open up that Pandora's box, the idea of psychological operations models led by the guiding question, who benefits, cui bono? Could these guys have been duped? Could O'Neill have been chosen because of his latent schizotypy and his predilection for paramimetic infection, right? Could this whole thing, EVP, the paranormal, all the way up to ghost hunters on television, could it all be a psychological operation to program the public mind and co-opt religious intent? Or could this all have to do with the psychobiological explanation that I am putting forward, that there's something called the parameme, which is like an infectious idea which is not good for your mind, that that forces you to adopt extra cognitive conclusions.
Right.
So anyway, all that being said, we need to get into the cognitive nature of delusions, cognitive neuropsychiatry, and to what level of involvement does anomalistic perception play a role. So now we're into what was the third explanation earlier, which was if Spiricom was a self-deceptive expression of O'Neill's mental instability. So now we're tying way back into what you said earlier, that sometimes folks take a road where they might be in the psychopathy zone just by virtue of what they had seen, and they don't have an appropriate cultural script, and they can't rewrite this in a way that makes their brain work because it doesn't fit a movie line. So I'm not saying that O'Neill was crazy when he came to this. There's also the possibility O'Neill and others are made crazy by this.
That's exactly right.
So there's a cautionary tale that there's a way to approach this stuff, which is why, David, we advocate the scientific habit of mind. It's the only critical way.
Exactly right.
It's the only critical way to protect yourself against really the cognitive delusions that seem so real that you'd want to go find a place to have them reinforced in a small group. As we discussed earlier, this whole idea of there's nothing to gain by sharing your experiences is completely untrue when you find the sympathetic ear of a small paranormal posse.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So, now I don't know if you give me a measure on this. If I'm putting folks to sleep, I don't want to do that, but I think it'd be cool to discuss, let's just say, the notion of testable frameworks for better understandings of really cognitive and the neural systems involved in delusions. These, in other words, plausible mechanisms for how certain pathological beliefs arise, like those manifested by some of these paranormal enthusiasts who come to not be able to discern, or the experiencers who come to no longer be able to discern fantasy from reality. As the boys from Paratopia call it, they say this is when people start playing Dungeons and Dragons in real life, the old acting out, the role-playing game from years ago.
They get sucked up into it, and it becomes a reality.
Yes, this self-constructed, like it becomes this social convention, a psychological norm among a small group, not objective reality.
Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And it's a self-created reality.
Yeah, which becomes quite dangerous.
Much like the trolls that we deal with.
Hold up. You've got your phone on your cheek there.
Yeah, much like the trolls that we deal with who sit in their mama's basement in their jockey shorts and nefariously attack away at all of us out here trying to learn something. They're living a reality vicariously through the false bravery of a video screen in front of their computer. And it's the same sort of mindset, and we have a lot of it in this field where, and this is a prime example to touch upon them because they are so prolific. They are people whose psychosis has altered their sense of reality to such that they feel that they're on some grand mission by trying to destroy people for doing legitimate work.
Yes.
And I think a lot of that is based on the fact that they're such abysmal failures themselves in creating or doing anything that they have to tear apart because they can't build.
Mm-hmm.
And they see that as their grand mission in life, their delusion of grandeur. I ripped apart Rountree, or I ripped apart Rorke. And the reality is, they're essentially nothing but a peon on a gnat's behind, because in the grand scheme of things, they'll never be remembered for anything other than being a pain in the rear end for a very short period of time. Whereas the people that are doing the real research will probably discover something that they'll be remembered for. And it's sad in many ways when you have to deal with that mentality based on their delusion of reality, and it's and a lot of people. In fact, the hosts of Paratopia have dealt with this in the UFO community to the extent that one of them is actually going to leave the show, and it's sad that it comes to that. I mean, I've always found, I was talking to you earlier today that, when you have a cyber stalker who knocks upon your door, you just, fire a couple of rounds of 45 ACP ammo over their heads, and it generally takes care of the problem. But that's another example of this phenomena that's a sideshow to the actual research. And I think what makes it so important in the Spiricom case study is that this event actually birthed the modern age ITC movement.
Oh, yeah, it did.
So the entire modern ITC movement may be based on a hoax.
Yeah. Well, now you just brought it. Yes, I mean, you have brought it down to the reality that folks are not getting. And this reminds me of an email that I had with someone after I'd been on Coast to Coast AM, and essentially it said, well, here is my opinion after having unfettered access to all of the meta-science archives, all of the heretofore unheard tapes and video of William O'Neill operating the Spiricom and all of this. And I said, well, it seems to me a hoax was perpetrated.
Yes.
And then, boy, you're right, the attacks came. The loonies who were looking for every reason to protect against disconfirmation of their beliefs, their intractable beliefs, which in the face of any new evidence they would not change. So instead, they attacked the messenger. And you were right. They came out and, guns a-blazing. The attacks included everything from non sequiturs to, check this out, well, what about ghost hunters? They're using EVP and blah, blah, blah. And then I wrote to them and said, well, don't you know what Spiricom was? And I'd done this show on it, and it's as if they hadn't even heard it. And they said, well, none of that's important because people today don't know what that is. Okay, then I had to explain to them, just because, dude, this is the patient emails. I try to walk someone to some sort of an understanding, but it doesn't work. So I try to explain that just because modern day, contemporary, like graveyard skulkers with tape recorders and maladapted equipment to the experiment, just because they don't know what Spiricom is, doesn't mean that it wasn't part of the foundational mythos of the cult of techno-mediumship, which grips the show Ghost Hunters.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, this whole techno mentality, see, that's the thing. There are many groups that are technical, but there are few groups that are scientific.
Ah. Mm-hmm.
And there's a huge difference between the two. I mean, and I make a point to talk about this in my book as well, is that, how often have you seen on TV someone dancing up and down and screaming Eureka because they have a spike on their EMF meter?
Oh, boy.
And that tells you nothing.
No, it doesn't.
But yet so much weight is placed upon things like that, or the K2 meter responding to your voice talking to it, or the flashlight trick where you slightly unscrew the flashlight so it's just off, and you lay it around, and then it seems to come on in response to your questions. Forget about the whole fact that there's a thing called arcing that occurs based on the relative humidity of the air and a lot of other natural things that make this thing periodically connect and disconnect that has nothing to do with the paranormal. I mean, these are like techno theatrics that are used to sell cornflakes.
But you notice each of these attempts at mediumship involves this technological component, not a medium, which means the foundational mythos of everything you're seeing today on TV that is popular, everything that is considered contemporary, quote-unquote, ghost hunting, it's rooted in Spiricom, where they took a technological approach. They took an instrumental transcommunication approach. And I know ITC had been done before that, but we're talking about is this attempt at real-time interactive communication through a repeatable process by way of a technological means. And that's what this Mark IV Spiricom was. But interestingly, it didn't really work for anyone else.
Yes, we could spend reams of paper and hours and tape on discussing that. Here's the problem with it, and here's why it's wrong. It is based on the assumption that, A, we are able to, after we die, manipulate energy, RF fields as well as audio fields, as well as devices. Now, there is some anecdotal evidence that devices may be manipulated, power may be interrupted, things of that nature. But it assumes a lot of things. It assumes, for example, that we can modulate our voice on an RF carrier. I mean, the entire ITC movement is based on the fact that you can tune into a radio and pick up spirits talking. Now, I put forward that if this were true, we would be hearing dead Grandma Moses on our AM radios in the morning when we were going to work.
But we don't.
But we don't. So here's the thing, and here's the telling part of the whole ITC movement. If we only hear these on the radios that they design or they put together, how is physics so selective that electronics theory only applies to a select group of individuals who have essentially modified a standard piece of radio reception gear, or in the case of SpiritCom, some military surplus transmitters and receivers, to communicate with the dead?
Well, I'll tell you why. It comes back to what we discussed as that EVP, ITC, alien abductee overlap, where it's this self-aggrandizement that places this person at the center of something very important.
That's exactly.
Yeah, like, I'm so important. Or in the case of William O'Neill, as you just said with SpiritCom, I just turned to the manual here, and I quote, this is regarding how George Meek concluded that it was O'Neill's mediumistic abilities. You see this fusion of technology and mediumship. It was O'Neill's mediumistic abilities that had imbued the SpiritCom device with the ability to communicate with the dead. Here's the quote. Our research has shown that our success with this system, Mark IV, was possible only because of certain psychic energies of a very listen to this, of a very rare nature possessed by the electronic technician operating the equipment. Well, I think the psychic energies, while described as being of a, quote, very rare nature, never were operationally defined. Therefore, they were never tested, thus rendering all SpiritCom evidence unfalsifiable, meaning it cannot be tested, essentially, while simultaneously reinforcing the delusional thinking of William O'Neill, the mechanism for the pathological beliefs inherent in his claims, and what became the intellectual pathology that others might succeed in similar attempts, despite all of Meek's, quote, evidence and experience to the contrary. This is our Chris Moon connection. This is a dude who tells everyone, get a box, do what I do, or pay me to do what I do, but it's only 30-something people that know how to do all this.
Yeah, it started out as being 20.
All right.
But see, when you come from this aspect, nothing you do will fall under the realm of
replicability.
Replicability. Why do I have so much trouble with that?
Everyone's got their word.
I have, for some reason, I have a terrible time with that thing.
Mine is anomalous. All right, go ahead.
That's hysterical.
Yeah.
Let's see, we're human.
Yeah.
We have our flaws, but yeah. So I mean,
for yourself.
The whole thing is now how Frank's box works.
Yeah.
Is really simple. They take an AM tuning chip, an IC that's normally put in every auto-tuning radio that has the auto-tune function. Usually car radios have this, but some home systems have it. And what they do is they take and they overbias the control transistor that turns on and turns off the auto-tuning function of the chip.
Yeah.
So what happens is because it has a constant overbias, it's continually scanning up and down the AM band.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the AM band is prolific with what?
Talk radio.
That's exactly right. So you're going to get people talking. So what's going to happen is that...
Oh, and I would just jump in here to also say that the DJs on FM radio, they just about don't ever shut up either.
Yeah, well, that's true, too. That's true, too. But it's funny, they experimented using an FM chip and then went back to the AM chip because they didn't get the results they wanted. Because there was a lot more music and things like that. But what happens is this thing goes, just like if you sit in your car radio, and try this sometime, turn on the AM radio, and just start rapidly going back across the dial, back and forth. You can do it with any AM radio. A little small transistor radio will prove the point. You just keep tuning back and forth. Well, you're going to get this as you go through. Well, you know what? If you do it long enough, it's going to start making words.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you really get your mind in the right place, the powers of the universe are flowing, and the chi force or the ki force or whatever is flowing properly through your chakras. Suddenly now this radio is talking to you and telling you exactly what you want to hear, when in essence it's really making a lot of noise and bits and pieces of pronunciations of words. Now, I have a colleague of mine that lives in Australia that's actually a linguist, and she verifies the fact, particularly with the English language, that by randomizing sounds and words, you can make sense 40 to 50% of the time just through sheer random assemblage of the words, and that's the nature of the language itself.
It comes down to the way our phonemes assemble.
Exactly. So what happens is you'll get bits and pieces of phonetics that assemble into a word. Mm-hmm. You'll get one or two words or a phrase that gets created, and suddenly that's a personal message from dead Uncle Albert from beyond the realm telling me what to do. But it's because the person, A, wants to hear from dead Uncle Albert, number one, and two, they are forming from the noise the words that they want to hear. Because I've heard some of the files these things generate, and I swear I'm not hearing what these people are claiming they're hearing.
Yeah, but the fact you hear something else, it implies that this verbal transformation effect is the real phenomenon, not so much that a dead person is talking.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Now, that verbal transformation effect, I think it's called on some of the shows like audio matrixing or whatever.
Matrixing is a big word right now. Like everybody in the paranormal field is using it, and no one has a clue what it means.
No, they don't know what it means, but it sounds totally awesome. Neo's in the Matrix, and so are you. But, nerd talk time. We should have a nerd talk warning. But the, EVP findings for the folks that are listening, unlike alien abductions, they're generally brief, and they require repeated listenings to discern as something resembling intelligible speech. So the listener, in the case of EVP, may be particularly prone to the verbal transformation effect and what's called apophenia. And that can be compounded by, and you say this word better than I, this, the pareidolia when you look at clouds and stuff. Obviously there can be like an auditory pareidolia. And the verbal transformation effect, to just put it in more common terms, is experienced as illusory changes in repeated words. And now, what people consider to be the founder of this, Radava, this was a guy who would concede in his own book, Breakthrough, to listening to his thousands of examples thousands of times. He's essentially creating the perfect situation for verbal transformation effect. Now, apophenia is the spontaneous perception of meaningfulness of unrelated phenomenon like auditory stimuli.
Exactly.
And pareidolia...
Pareidolia is just a subset of that effect. It's a form of it.
Well, precisely. It's a type of misperception involving obscure stimulus being perceived as clear and distinct. So if you take those three things together, I know a lot of folks, they call them the same thing, and I'm arguing that it's this perfect storm of three separate, nuanced phenomenon. It is the verbal transformation effect, which again is an experience of the illusory changes in repeated words. Apophenia is the spontaneous perception of meaningfulness of unrelated phenomenon, like bits and pieces of phonemes as auditory stimuli. And pareidolia is a type of misperception involving obscure stimulus being perceived as clear and distinct and meaningful. And so you can see that whereas apophenia in EVP perception, let's call it audio Rorschach, where meaning is attributed to brief sounds heard on audio media, explainable as artifacts of auditory perception, whereas apophenia in EVP might suffice for the truncated voice phenomenon in most EVPs, the Spiricom recordings, being of such length and apparent interaction, really require an explanation beyond apophenia, compounded by this thing we're calling, auditory pareidolia, all undergirded by this verbal transformation effect. And that's why you need to look past it, which is why we'd want to get, if not this episode, we'd want to eventually get into a little bit more on pre-decisional distortion, how that might play with the cognitive nature of delusions and with what we know about. There's really considerable evidence from cognitive neuropsychology for the involvement of anomalistic perception and what's called, this, you'll love this phrase, probabilistic reasoning. And there's even something called metacognition and attribution bias. Anyway, it all plays into delusional formation of ideas. And that doesn't mean people are crazy. It just means that unless you're aware of these things, they take hold. They grip the mind. It begins to change the storyline, so to speak. And it becomes a more compact and infectious idea that gets repeated in a small group of folks with a wishful ear to hear these things, and then it's compounded by your compulsion to retell the story because of this reward you get. There's this cycle of, these folks have a cycle of reward and attention seeking. Yeah, and it doesn't mean that they're, mommy didn't love them. None of this is meant to be disparaging. We're trying to be pretty clinical here. So anyway, what do you think about that direction?
No, I agree. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And, these are things that, to us, I don't know about you, to me it's an annoyance.
Yeah, and to me it's one of the most fascinating parts of it, so that's why this is good.
It's fascinating from your aspect because you're into that. You're into studying that mindset. To me, it's aggravating because I'm dealing with these jerks on a daily basis.
Oh, I know. But you know what? The more we can recognize each of these kind of these processes that would have the retelling of events done wrong and would really fuel a mythos rather than fact. The more you can identify those, the more you can redact them from the data set and make the data set stronger.
Well, and also, too, it helps you to cope with them when you understand it better. One of the key things that has happened to me over the course of all this is as I have understood the makeup of these people, it comes a lot easier to deal with them because you understand, A, how to diffuse them, B, how to effectively deal with them and wipe your hands of the situation, and C, apply a mortal blow to their psyche so that they'll never mess with you again. So consequently, it's good to study this aspect of it from my point of view, but it doesn't take away from the fact that they're extraordinarily aggravating.
Yeah, they are, yes. Well, I'm down with your intellectual kung fu take on it. That is pretty cool.
Well, I mean, I try to oversimplify as much as I can, and the bottom line is that's the common sense thing that you're dealing with there. You're dealing with miscreants that, due to their inadequacies, must take it out on you or someone like you.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be a very prolific number of people or effects or I want to say a psychosis because they are nuts of the field. And I think we see it more in this field because of the nature of the field itself number one.
Oh, yeah.
Because you have to be a little loony to get involved with it in the first place. And two, something could happen that pushes you over the edge, and suddenly you're a full-blown wacko.
Now, you know what? Yes, it's true, but now I'm going to defend something which is wildly unpopular to defend, because while I defend, I incidentally offend, and I'm really not trying to do that. I don't think folks get this. I hope listeners don't get like an attitude from me.
I think if we come across like, hey, this is, we're not trying to, beat on anybody's drum here, but this is an observance, and it's something that we should realistically look at from a rational point of view.
Well, now here, in my defense of interest in the paranormal as something that's not really crazy, because I'm fascinated by it, I don't consider myself nuts, I contend, and here's my accidental offense as I defend. My accidental offense is when you look at the world's religions, which are publicly acceptable. People go to churches, people go to synagogues. They all tell crazy stories.
Oh, yes.
And they tell these insane tales, which now just factually, evidentially. Now, I'm not saying anything about what someone should or should not believe. I'm trying to be really clear about this. We don't need like a South Park Muslim situation going on here. But in all seriousness, the stories that are told are like about sons of God coming, and they're dead, they're not dead, they're rising, all this is going on, you see. And this is like, yeah, that happened, it's cool. But you talk about the possibility of extra dimensions having some influence, possibly under this theoretical framework, and a discussion of the validity of these things, and that's, woo, man, that's real crazy.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, put on a scale, the loonies in the pews forking over the cash every Sunday, on a scale, those cats have it. If you ask me, they have it all the way to Sunday, man. On top of that, the book is fraught with these internal inconsistencies, and this is not an attack on religion. What I'm saying is, it is an imperfect system. And there are people who study it, called theologians, and they attempt to rectify the inconsistencies and make the process a better experience for its adherents.
That's right.
You can see that all we're trying to do is the same thing with this issue of the quote-unquote paranormal. That's all we're trying to do. So the folks who want to, come at us with, the teeth out, the fangs dripping with blood and all that, take it elsewhere, because I'm not into the incendiary stuff. I'm kind of down with the intellectual process of things. Someone can really claim just about anything they'd like to me. If you can back it up with some logical underpinning, I'd entertain the thought very politely, So if we can kind of bring some semblance like that. Now, if that doesn't happen, I'm with you, where it's time to, I prefer my 9. I know they're probably not quite up to your standard, but listen, the clip load's easy, fast, and that's how I roll. So
you've got more rounds. That's the difference.
Well, that's the thing, yes. So we both, in the end, we're both going to take it street level if it comes down to it, but we are trying to bring some civility to it and trying to bring some intellectual honesty to the paranormal.
That's the difference too. In religion, you're dealing with belief and faith.
Mm-hmm.
These are two things that are without definition. All right? What we are doing, though, belief and faith have very little to do other than in yourself and your methodologies with what you're going after. You're actually looking for a physical trail of evidence. And that's the difference. Religion is meant to be a faith. It's meant to be a belief.
That's right.
What we are doing is meant to be a discipline. And should be a discipline.
Should be.
It isn't.
In other words, that's the vision we share.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's all about perception. There are a lot of people in the field who are faith-based. They are believing, and they have faith, and they have belief, and that's what is driving them. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Nope.
But call a spade a spade.
Yeah, don't call it science.
Don't call it science, because it isn't. It's you're entertaining yourself, you're following a belief, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it isn't science. It is faith, it is belief. And like I say, there There's a lot of that, and that's fine. But let's call it what it is. Let's not get out there and parade it for something that it isn't, because that's what gives the potential of this being a field a bad name.
That's right. And that's why, a future discussion, it's obviously not in the time frame for tonight, but a future discussion, the distinction between, almost like a kind of, we'll make this as really interesting, a distinction between science and pseudoscience. And people would be surprised how much of what they think is science is actually pseudoscience.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And the biggest battle is to separating those two.
That's right.
And, I see it with gadgetry all the time. You see these things, the K2 meter. They're making a certain self-proclaimed psychic very wealthy. There's another device out there called the ovulus.
Yes.
Or they call it the puck. Mm-hmm. And this is what few people read the fine print in these things. First of all, it has a built-in dictionary.
Oh, boy.
Of words that are put in by the designer.
We're back to this,
selects the words. He selects the words and puts them in to this database that's on board the device. It stores, I think, something like 10,000 words. And then, based on different aspects of the environment that the device measures, uncalibrated, by the way, such as EMF, magnetic fields, different things, temperature changes, fluctuations, it selects a word from that list and assembles the words. Sometimes you just get one word, or if you have a complex waveform or complex events that the device is measuring, you might get a phrase or a sentence. Now, it's always going to be related to paranormal because the deck is stacked before you start using it, number one.
Yeah, just about anything that thing would generate, you'd say, wow, boy, that's pretty strange. They're
saying something that's very pertinent. And the words that are picked out are carefully picked out to make sense in a lot of different situations. So, and then in the fine print on their website, they have this device does not claim to be able to communicate with the dead. It is a novelty item only, blah, 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 blah. But it's so small, it's got to have this disclaimer on there, or these guys will go to jail.
Now, shouldn't the disclaimer be at least the size of the Surgeon General's warning on a cigarette case?
Well, see, that's the thing. As long as it's there, they're covered legally. It doesn't have to be readable without a magnifying glass. It just has to be there. And it's up to the user to beware,
Well, it sure is. Now, this comes back to something Jim Hale used to say all the time. The technology is not the experiment.
No.
And this is where it gets all mixed up with this K2 meter. Someone 4 blocks away makes a cell phone call. You're going to get a ping.
That's exactly right. It's even worse than that.
Oh,
someone turns on their microwave in the house, you get a ping. You get too close to the clock on the wall, you get a ping.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. It's unshielded. It has a very wide bandwidth, so it's picking up things all across the frequency spectrum. There's no shielding. There's no directionality, so it's omnidirectional in its response. And it isn't accurate because all you're seeing is flashing lights on the K2 meter, for example, and it's not calibrated.
So again, this device meant for techno-mediumship really becomes an exercise in the human's ability to recognize patterns and meaning when there is none.
That's exactly right. And it boils down to this. If you are looking for EMF with an EMF meter, you are fooling yourself and wasting your time. Because all you're going to know is that you have EMF. You're not going to know what frequency it is, and it very well probably is going to be 60 cycles, which is, everywhere in our environment.
Yeah, pervasive.
The only way to study EMF is to actually look at the waveform, actually see what the frequency of it is, and analyze the actual mechanics of the waveform itself to determine how it could be manufactured or what it may be. And the only way to do that is by using a sensor and an oscilloscope. And very few people are doing that. And if everyone did that, you would be amazed at the amount of discoveries. There would be bucketfuls of discoveries coming forward because people would be in all these areas where there's activity, and they would actually be seeing something that was pertinent to the whole scheme of things. And I can't preach that enough. If you can only buy one piece of equipment, buy an oscilloscope, and get a MagCheck 95 from Magnetic Sciences for $95, and you're in business. The whole package will run you about $400. And now, you've got a tool that you can data load to your laptop for analysis, run it in real time with software on your PC, and it's evidence that's hard empirical evidence that you can't fake. This is stuff that unless you can hack the software and change all sorts of parameters, you can't fake this evidence. So it's evidence that's very strong, and it stands the test of scrutiny.
Yeah, it's not subject to selective analysis.
That's exactly right. You've either got something or you don't. And I can't preach that enough. But,
yeah, and so it comes back to our, here's our nerd lesson for the evening, the difference between validity and reliability, and why these are both important. So you got validity, and a lot of people, they throw that word around. Again, this is about scientific trappings. They throw the word around like, well, we have validity in our process because we repeat it the same way. Well,
same mistakes over and over again.
Yeah, see, validity is actually the extent to which the test you're doing measures what it claims to measure. It's that simple. And, I mean, it's obviously vital for a test to be valid, and so this is why you would need these type of measurements you're talking about so that the results could be accurately applied and interpreted. And this is where reliability comes from. It refers to the consistency of a measure. So a test is considered reliable if you get the same or similar results, repeatedly.
That's right.
Right, and we don't mean the same mistakes repeatedly, which is a whole other thing.
That's a path of its own there.
Yeah, it sure is. Now, all this and more can be found in your forthcoming book, David, Paranormal Technology, A Guide to Understanding the Science of Ghost Hunting.
That's exactly right, and you actually are one of the few to pre-read it.
Oh, it's a great book. It really is.
And offer a blurb for the back cover, which is greatly appreciated.
Well, we'll be doing like audio reviews here as we go, and then got to formalize it. But yeah, you can't. It seems like a perfect time to mention that you just cannot be complimented enough on showing the reader how to walk through this process of intellectual honesty we're talking about. How to take really. Anyone, you could have a pretty mushy approach to this, and after reading this book, you would actually have a scientific habit of mind that you could take to the field and practice it. And you could still operate outside the mainstream paradigm, but you'd be able to do so through a dispassionate analysis of data to reach real conclusions. And if you want to know what actually happened when you think something anomalous has happened, you should do what David does in the book. Begin with a null hypothesis. This is saying that nothing extraordinary happened. I know that's tough for a lot of folks, but that's where you have to start. Then you should examine, as David advises, with the technology he recommends, you examine each piece of evidence that something extraordinary maybe did happen, but you do so individually upon its own merits. You don't cherry pick. Then you discover if there's an explanation for each piece of evidence that supports or denies that hypothesis we talked about, right? And then, if you eliminate worldly explanations before considering otherworldly explanations, let's just say your conclusions would be a whole lot more valid and reliable.
That's exactly right. I couldn't say it better.
Yeah.
And the thing that was the challenge of writing the book was to keep it at two levels. Number one, I wanted to appeal to the average Joe who's out there trying to understand what's going on and trying to do the right thing, but really lacks a source for getting the right information. And two, I wanted to have it on a higher level so that people with a background in science and possibly someone influential in the field of physics or other areas that could lend a hand would read it and be inspired to assist with research from their own perspective as well. So there's a lot of technical speak interlaced with commonsensical speak, whereas I will go into a nerd talk where I will go to the nth degree of what's going on with physics, and then I will come back and in a couple of sentences say what this really means is blah, 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 so that the average person says, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So keeping it on two levels was the biggest challenge without losing continuity in each chapter, because as you read, I can go off on some pretty serious tangents with the theoretical parts of it.
Yeah, as we both do.
But then I try to come down to earth with the one paragraph of this is what this really means, you know.
No, that's the thing. It's really, in so many ways, it's concise. I don't think you meander. It's all great economy of language. The book is real tight.
Well, I try to make it entertaining to read, too. I mean, the reader needs to be entertained because it does get dry in places, because you're dealing with data. You know, you're dealing with analytical stuff.
That's right.
And sometimes you have to kind of keep the person entertained. So I'm always flying off with a statement like, you know, hold on, but wait a minute, or, you know, not so fast, you know, after a conclusion is reached. That's not necessarily the complete conclusion type of thing. So I try to keep it entertaining along the way so that it's actually kind of a developing story within the story of how to use these devices. And then we actually put a few experiments in there so people can play with. You know, I tried to, and then some theories, some of my own theories, and some of the notions that are commonly held in the field right now, and point out the weaknesses and the strengths of those hypotheses would be the better word. So yeah, I mean, what I wanted it to be was a tool for ghost hunter groups that want a little more out of what they're doing. Don't just want to do the same old thing every weekend, run around with a couple of pieces of handheld gear and make a pronouncement. There's the tools in the book for any group to elevate themselves to a scientific level and approach to their ghost hunting.
Which, again, the appeal is, that is needed because if we want to attract the folks we need to attract, so that we can bring to bear the experts and their expertise, if we can bring those folks and their expertise to bear upon the paranormal problem, we might actually get something solved. But if you continue to alienate them with, you know, kook-ass, way out stuff, man, you know, that's really going to make them run, turn tail, and duck and cover, which is the current state of affairs.
Oh, yeah.
With the exception of the folks you've interfaced with, because I would dare to say, here's the pattern. Your approach is scientific, so they respond because you speak their language.
That's exactly right. And the only way we are going to get that is to speak their language.
Yeah, so it's time to, get down with the language, get down with these scientific habits of mind, and the only way to do that, well, there's a couple of paths. Continue your search, get David's book, Paranormal Technology, A Guide to Understanding the Science of Ghost Hunting, and let's see. Continue to listen to The Devil's Advocate and what Paratopia shows are being brought to you.
Absolutely.
Now, in future episodes, this may be, this is all subject for change, but now...
At a moment's notice, apparently.
Yeah, well, exactly. I'm just going to throw a few things out there for anyone else who might hear it. They want to comment. If they'd like us to go these directions, I'm going to throw some ideas out you're welcome to as well. The first is, I think at least some portion of the next show ought to be taken to follow up on this idea of a meme. I mean, I know I called it an infectious idea, but, the question kind of must linger in the thinking man's mind. Well, Rorke, if these para-memes are so, potentially problematic for their hosts, particularly like what we're describing as these fringe idea or hard-to-explain memes, if they're essentially like a psychogenic contagion, well then, how can their spread, how can their replication be a part of the Darwinian survival contest, how does this para-meme idea make any sense in the grand scheme of things from like a psychobiological approach? So
absolutely.
I have a pretty good theory for that. I've got this notion of para-meme reinforcement. We can discuss para-meme protection. We can discuss how logical fallacies become impervious to the para-meme.
Impervious. I love that word.
Yeah,
Impervious.
and we discussed some of the conclusions after all this and maybe some further research. And some of the brain chemistry involved, by the way, would be fascinating for listeners, I think, when I discussed this notion of like an attention-seeking, then reward cycle.
Well, there's another aspect that goes with the chemistry as well, and that's the actual electronics of the brain.
Oh, yes.
The chemical electro reactions of the brain, or electrochemical, I guess would be the right way to put it. I'm getting myself back asswards here. But the actual impulses that are involved with this sort of thing, as well as the chemical processes that are involved, I think, are an area that is rarely talked about. So, I mean, that would be kind of blazing a trail, pretty much.
Yeah, and it all feeds into this adopting of extra-cognitive conclusions, really. They're not well thought out. So, yeah, that's a cool place to go, and, we'll be discussing, dopamine receptors and how this all goes on. Essentially, yes, you heard me say dopamine receptors, so that this retelling of the tales and the experiencing of the experiences becomes almost a drug unto itself, at least.
Well, think of it like you're programming a hard drive. The more you put the data in, the more it stays put. I mean, you're actually defragging it into some semblance of reality. So,
exactly.
I mean, these are things that bear exploring. One of the things that I want to bring up, because of your involvement in the ITC case study, is the concept of actually building an ITC device based on reality and science instead of hoopla and hoaxology. So,
yes.
And, we actually have a model we're playing with that I put together very cheaply, and I have a model that's very expensive. So, but it's off-the-shelf stuff that anyone can purchase, and you don't have to have ethereal powers from the beyond to be able to operate it. So those are practical aspects. Yeah, that would be a practical subject that we would go into, because I kind of like touching on practical as well as theoretical, to help the listeners get some direction on things that they can actually do in the field to improve their chances of finding something.
That's right. The theoretical complements the applied, so absolutely.
Exactly.
Now, to complement that, because that's going to ground folks, and now I don't have any inside track. I'm going to wait for that conversation so that it's fresh and new on the for the eavesdroppers. But this idea of the psychological operation I brought up earlier, right. There's a direct overlap, since we're talking to a Paratopia podcast crew who have an interest in the paranormal and the ufological. This idea of the psychological operation, it needs to be discussed, that there's this incredible overlap about what the need to program the public mind seems to be. This, I don't know if it is co-opting religious intent or not, but there sure is a whole lot of interesting ties from Andrea Puharich, all the way up to CIA work called MK Ultra.
Yep.
This all kind of
and all these other things.
Oh yes, and it all can be brought to bear upon this idea of a psychological operation in the paranormal, which psyops. Yes, we can tease out the evidence for that in a future show.
Yeah, and the thing that's fascinating also for the Paratopia folks out there, their primary focus is on ufology, and the thing that I try to put out there is that all this stuff is really related.
Sure it is.
The phenomena involved in the ghost phenomena is the same phenomena that you're dealing with all the aspects of the paranormal. There's a common denominator that runs through all of it. And I had a couple of questions on the forum board that I tried to address today about EMF and EVP and that sort of thing. But all of these things are present in all things we label paranormal. So there's a common denominator that's actually measurable in all of this stuff. And all of the fields that are lumped loosely into the paranormal nomer should apply aspects of this commonality to their research, because I think the answers are going to lie in the scientific aspect of the phenomena and not the problematic mindsets that tend to color the evidence collected in the phenomena. And that touches base back on what you're talking about. So
yeah. Now to just to quickly continue the overlap between the paranormal and the ufological, Nick Redfern has recently written a great book, and if I could summarize the book, he essentially establishes through government documents that the UFO research community served as a useful laboratory in which to observe the effects of propaganda and disinformation, precisely because it's driven in large part by, an intent to expose the cover-up, right? So it turns out that UFO research communities were infiltrated, disinformation inserted, and the effects of that disinformation observed, and this is a psychological operation. Well, I'm suggesting that the same could be documented, maybe not to the same extent, but to some extent in the paranormal. Specifically, we could talk about the Spiricom case. If we look at exploring implications of study as a consequence of exposing the Spiricom story as a hoax, we need to ask, well, was it a psychological operation, just as one of the questions? Was Spiricom nothing more than, let's say, a conspiracy to assassinate the character of the real George Mueller who worked for NASA, just because they used the name George Mueller for this obscure Orange Coast Community College professor, like basically a big nobody versus this NASA Mueller who would be tied to many Defense Department contracts. Maybe it was that. Maybe it was the entire event remotely influenced or, by the likes of Puharich, this CIA handler for the Spoonbender, did for some nefarious means by way of MKUltra technology and or techniques. I'm willing to explore all that. And in the end, it does come back to the psychobiological explanation for these ideas, like the paramine. Why would part of the human condition be adopting extra cognitive conclusions, and how can we think our way out of the problem? So, first Dr. Phil would say, first you got to recognize you have a problem. So that's part of the process, is to say, hey, these are the things I could be doing wrong. These are the things I could be involved in, self-sabotage, completely unbeknownst to my conscious mind.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's part of being the devil's advocate, is that we have to constantly check and balance ourselves to make sure that what we put out is reliable and is logical.
Yes.
And we've constantly got to check and balance ourselves and judge ourselves based on that notion. And it's really true. I mean, even all of us who are driven, sometimes we can be driven so hard we become blind to certain things.
Oh, yeah.
And we have to be careful of that, because that's how you let inconsistencies creep into what you're doing. And I'm almost anal about my approach to it, so I constantly beat myself up. I have these arguments with myself in the wee hours of the morning over conclusions that I reach and that sort of thing, just so that I try to turn every stone. And that's the important thing that this will do, is if we can teach folks to look inward and to assess themselves realistically, it will make their data more powerful.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's all about the data set, and then we can talk about interpretation.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, so we've answered questions, and we've question answers.
Yes, and our little podcast is growing.
Yes, indeed. With the help of the Paratopia guys. That's great.
Yes, many thanks to them for giving us this little boost here. And we can remind folks that when we're not featured on Paratopia, our podcast will be up every week at the spinvestigations.org site. So if you want to follow us, it'll be posted. Usually we have it up by Monday. It seems like we're hitting pretty close to reality with that. We usually have it up on Monday, and then you can follow us as well in your off time when you're not listening to Paratopia.
Excellent.
And we promise to try to be constructive and witty and funny and nerdy. And you can email us if you have specific questions about on our website where the podcast is archived. We actually have both our email addresses, so if you've got a question for either one of us, you can pop us an email, and we'll address it on the next show.
Excellent. And on that note, David?
It's been real, and it's been fun, but it hadn't been real fun.
All right, brother. Till next time, my man. Till next time.
All righty. Looking forward to it, and I need another cup of coffee.
Heck yeah. All right, brother. We'll talk.
All righty.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, there you have it, folks. Was that not frickin' spectacular? I think that was probably the science lesson that Jeff had wanted so many episodes ago. Next week, John Galanders, a listener of the show, does the first solo episode. So he will be talking about his experiences and his theories. And so that will give you yet another taste of what this new direction of Paratopia can be. Right now, I'd like to throw out something, which is my hat for money. That's right, I'm going to beg you for money. The reason I'm going to beg you for money is because I am completely strapped for cash, unemployed, and yet an opportunity has arisen that I feel like I can't let go without a fight. So, the opportunity is to go cross-country to South Dakota with Teokasin Ghost Horse and a number of his friends to meet the elders. He's doing this at the end of July. I invited myself along. I'd love to say he invited me, but I actually was like, Can I go? And yeah, he enthusiastically said yes. So I would like to do that. I have no money to do that. If you would like me to do that, then kindly send me your money, and I will do it, and I will, I'm sure, talk about it on the show. Maybe it'll be a road trip episode, although I don't know how much technology I'm really going to want to bring on this trip. I don't even know if I really want to bring my cell phone on this trip. But in any event, if the trip can happen for me, it's because of you. So if you would like to donate to the Jeremy Vaeni Goes and Meets the Elders Fund, you can send donations through the PayPal using the email address KynesianHouse@yahoo.com. That's KYNEGION house, all one word, at yahoo.com. Or you can email me at paratopiapodcast@gmail.com, and we can take it from there. All right, thank you very much in advance. Onward, upward, and through? Question mark?